Jeremy Clarkson called this the meanest, butchest, handsomest, rumblingest powerhouse of a car, and then promptly raced it against a Lamborghini Diablo and won. It has 200 horsepower more than a contemporary Porsche Turbo, a huge trunk, and an interior trimmed with the hides of 10 cows. This is the Aston Martin Vantage V550, and it is a twin-supercharged monster, perfect for those for whom too much is not enough. The only car you could buy at the time with more power was a McLaren F1, but they couldn't be any more different. The F1 is all cleverness and high technology, and this thing, it's brute force and an unshakable sensation that it's actually from the 1960s and not the 1990s. Aston Martin has a long and illustrious history of nearly going out of business. This, coupled with its small size, meant that the company tended to extract as many years as possible from its production models during the second half of the 20th century. This car represents that. It is one of just 5 basic road car models produced by Aston Martin during the 4.5 decades between 1950 and the arrival of the DB7. Aston Martin has changed hands many times, but among its tumultuous history, the 25 years of David Brown's ownership from 1947 to 1972 stand out not only as the longest single ownership of Aston Martin, but also some of its best years. Driven by his enthusiasm for speed and motorsport, not to mention the money from his family's successful engineering and manufacturing firm, David Brown bought the entire Aston Martin company for £20,500 and Lagonda for £52,500, joining them together to create Aston Martin Lagonda. They produced a succession of iconic sports and touring cars, raced in Formula 1, and won both Le Mans and the World Sports Car Championship. Brown's initials, DB, adorned nearly every model produced during this period, and his impact was so great that his initials are still used today. David Brown took the company's products from strength to strength, using 3 different engines over the decades. The first of these was the inline-6 designed under the supervision of Walter Owen Bentley while working at Lagonda, and in fact it was specifically to get this engine that Brown purchased Lagonda. Once it reached the limit of its development, including a Le Mans victory in 1959 driven by Carroll Shelby and Roy Salvadori, the Lagonda engine was succeeded by a larger inline-6, and a decade later, a larger still V8, both of which were designed in-house by Aston Martin's talented engineer Tadek Marek. The V8 was a fantastic 5.3-liter all-alloy quad-cam unit designed to power the last car introduced during the David Brown years, the DBS. Tasked with providing a new engine with 30% more power than the outgoing inline-6, Marek began working on the V8 in 1963. Its early development shaped up well, and it looked like just the thing to combat both the growing size and weight of Aston's cars, and also those pesky high-performance machines coming out of Italy. By 1967, Aston Martin was confident enough to release a racing version of the new engine, which would pair perfectly with Lola's new racing car, the T70 Mark III. What was supposed to be a triumphant debut at 1967's 24-hour Le Mans race ended with embarrassment, as the 2 Aston Martin-engined Lolas retired with engine failure after just 2 and 30 laps. Aside from the V8, the rest of the DBS was ready, so it was put in production with the old inline-6 in 1967, while the V8 was substantially re-engineered, finally arriving in the DBS 2 years later. The wait was worth it. The V8's arrival marked the start of a 31-year dynasty lasting until 2000 and powering every Aston Martin made for 20 years, including this one. In 1970, the DBS V8's 0-60 in under 6 seconds and 160 mph top end made it one of the world's fastest cars, offering performance that wasn't far off a Lamborghini Miura or Ferrari Daytona. but a hotter version was in the works, although it was delayed until 1977 by one of the 7 times that Aston Martin declared bankruptcy in its history. When it finally arrived, the Vantage created a sensation. It was widely regarded as Britain's first supercar, despite having the engine in the front, a swanky leather-trimmed interior, and back seats. It had 25% more power than the standard V8, with chassis and aerodynamic improvements to go with, and as a result, it accelerated to 60 miles an hour quicker than a Porsche Turbo, Ferrari Boxer, or Lamborghini Countach. It was the quickest car in the world. Aston Martin's financial situation and low production volumes, a car or two a day typically, meant that new models appeared infrequently. Nevertheless, a shocking new model appeared at the same time, the Lagonda. An absolute spaceship of a luxury sedan, it cost more than twice as much as a typical house, and was full of electronic wizardry that blew the development budget, always broke, and delayed the car's deliveries repeatedly. But it was truly like nothing else, and during the 1980s, it accounted for as much as 68% of the company's annual output. It was powered by the now familiar V8 mounted in a new chassis, which also formed the basis for the new two-door car, which was being developed in the second half of the 1980s. The new car, called the Virage, was welcomed enthusiastically since the outgoing car's design was nearly 2 decades old by this point. Initially, there was huge demand for the Virage during the consumption-crazed 80s, but then the bottom fell out of the market. The recession of the early 90s crippled the exotic car market, and Aston Martin's production dropped by 75%. The car itself was a modernized take on the traditional Aston formula. It was lighter, stronger, more aerodynamic, and easier to build, but it was still a powerful front-engine 4-seat GT that was beautifully hand-finished inside and out. Also traditional were the car's mechanical ingredients. It used an evolution of its predecessor's non-independent DD-on rear suspension and the 5.3-liter V8 that was designed in the 1960s, albeit with some big upgrades. To modernize the engine, Aston Martin put out bids to Lotus, Porsche, and Cosworth, but the work ultimately went to Callaway, who had heard about the job and made what ended up being the winning submission. They designed 4-valve heads and intakes to go with, while new electronic fuel injection system together with catalytic converters made it run cleaner as well. Since the early 50s, Aston Martin had always used the Vantage name for high-performance versions of its two-door cars. But the hot version of the Virage was truly next level, recalling the lunacy of the 1970s Vantage. The 90s Vantage was called the V550 for its engine's 550 horsepower output, and the car was so heavily reworked that only the doors and roof panel remained the same. Lights, grille, fenders, bumpers, all of it was changed. The engine transformed to the same extent. 2 superchargers with intercoolers were added, and the only component shared with the Virage engine was the oil sump. Every other component was strengthened, upgraded, or revised. The enormous Roots-type superchargers made by Eaton draw 40 horsepower and are thus fitted with bypass valves to disengage them when the driver isn't requesting boost. The chassis and brakes were significantly upgraded too, including redesigned rear suspension and enormous 6-piston Brembo front brakes. Substantially flared fenders cover massive 285 section tires, while the completely revised look of the car was honed in the wind tunnel, dropping lift at speed to 0 and even adding a small pair of Venturis under the car by moving the exhaust. The result of all this is a top speed around 300 kilometers an hour, 186 miles an hour, and 0 to 60 in about 4.5 seconds. These were proper supercar numbers for the era, as the Diablo race showed. But what the Vantage offers beyond numbers is what really differentiates it from every other car capable of this kind of performance. Aston Martin excitedly reported that their efforts to modernize production in the early 90s reduced the time required to build a car by nearly 20%, from 16 weeks to 13 weeks. These cars took such a long time to build because they weren't just assembled by hand, the entire thing was made by hand, all the way from the chassis to the aluminum body panels to the engines to the upholstery. This made them among the very last truly hand-built cars. The old-school character of the V550 is equally obvious in the driving experience. Certain specific details of its functionality feel 90s, but the overall character is reminiscent of fast GTs of the 1960s. Cars like the Lamborghini Espada, Jensen Interceptor, and this car's ancestor, the DBS. It's fast, elegantly proportioned, and has a gorgeous interior with a generous helping of parts bin components from other manufacturers, and it gets things done in an old-school front-engine rear-wheel drive sort of way. First, the modern bits. The engine starts instantly and it fuels and runs perfectly at all times. Then there's the wide tires and massive brakes, which provide good grip and face-melting deceleration coupled with ABS, which is much closer to a car from today than to a 1960s one. The rest of it is pretty vintage. The ride is brittle and busy on bumpy roads, but on smooth roads the car's road holding is actually sort of brilliant. As long as you don't ask it to change directions very quickly, it's a sure-footed, fluid, and competent car, the ideal high-speed, long-distance tourer. The automatic transmission, a 6-speed manual was also available, is hilariously old-fashioned, but it barely matters because of the engine. The supercharger noise is present, but not overwhelming, and the engine's vocabulary consists of one word only: torque. No matter the RPMs, there is a huge reserve of torque, causing the car to lunge forward like a powerboat. It sort of sounds like one too, although the absolute noise level isn't that high. It's still a vaguely civilized touring car after all. If you boot the throttle when the steering wheel is anything but straight, there's a good chance that you'll get power oversteer, but it's easily controlled thanks to the long wheelbase, a bit like how I'd imagine going sideways in an ocean liner is. Nothing about driving this car at normal speeds is particularly difficult or cantankerous. Another 90s characteristic that differentiates it from both vintage cars and the exotics that were its contemporaries. In fact, it's a genuinely fantastic place to be. The wood, leather, and carpets are fabulously indulgent. It's easy to see out of, the control forces are reasonable, the driving position is comfortable. When pressing on, however, another side of the car emerges. If you lack talent or confidence, it's easy to fall behind the car, such is its old-fashioned hooligan approach to going fast. It feels a little out of control as it approaches the limit, even though it's not actually. The V550 has a ton of character, including a great sense of humor. Its appeal lies in the way that it combines an air of respectability, underpinned by genuine usefulness, with feral, unhinged performance. It's a quintessentially old-world British approach to speed. The car is a little old-fashioned under the skin, but has been dragged into modernity, which gives it huge charm, even if the average enthusiast has no idea what it is or what it can do. The flip side of this is that in an era where the market for less performant Porsches and Ferraris of the same period is wildly superheated, this car, of which fewer than 250 were made, represents insane value for money. After all, where else can you melt pavement in the comfort and fragrance that can only be provided by the hides of 10 cows?